So we're in the middle of the first of the closing round calls for the Consciousness Deep Dive. It's June 26th, and we're coming back from some breakout groups to hear a little bit of the essence of some sense-making and meaning-making conversations that have been happening.
Well, I'll speak first. Do you hear me first?
We do. If you can project a little more, that would be useful. Yes.
Yay. I'll speak to one of our two, and and Lila June spoke of it, and all the warriors on one side, the best of the heart, resonating. That's the energy, and coming together, all of us in one-on-one or in committee work, anything we're doing in our families. The necessity to, well, keep in mind, keep in heart the energy that we share, and how we are with one another, slow enough, caring enough in the process is how we get anywhere. So how we are is where we get, and remembering that kind of presence is also speaks to, as you mentioned, Ben, and instead of fighting, and as Suzanne said, instead of fighting against, remembering to look toward and be toward that celebrating and creating. So that's the one. Next.
Yeah, I'm talking about the importance of joy and creativity, music, and we didn't say dancing, but dancing, and wherever we can offer that as part of our common humanity and being together, really valuable.
Any more that group wants to add to those two?
I loved a quote from Michelle, which was, energy is in one's presence, and how we are is what we get.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is that group?
I can share.
Well, hang on, Liza. Let's just make sure this group is.
Oh, okay.
I think they are. Okay. Yes. Go ahead, Liza.
Oh, sorry. It's hard without seeing you. I apologize. I was just going to say that I loved what was shared in our group, that as we process what we are all going through together, I love that all emotions can be present and then integrated and normalized and then transmuted into peace. And for me, that's what I will take away from listening to everybody today.
Linda, I thought you had a nice handle on the overall essence of things too. Would you like to speak to
that? You mean about the evolutionary call of feeling like we're being called, those of us who feel called to community, to come together like this in small groups and share intimately in safe places. I feel that as we are part of nature and nature is part of us, evolution happens within nature. And this is evolution happening within us, this call to come together and create community, because we're going to need each other in a very uncertain future. So while we know that we don't know what the future is going to bring, we do know that we can come together and create safe places to share whatever it is, to share our wisdom, our knowledge, what's going on. And somebody much earlier said that this it's just coming together is a place of certainty, safety, assuredness. And that's what we all need. And I feel like that's why we're called to these groups, to create community.
I was thinking earlier how any movement in society starts with one person speaking to another person. You think of how the women began their conversations in kitchen tables, in living rooms, one or two or three people saying, why is it that we can't vote? Why is it that we have to do what we're owned basically by our husbands and so forth? And the civil rights movement, same thing. It didn't start by people getting up and making speeches and passing laws. That came, decades after the conversations. And so now we have a technology here where people, all over the world, small groups of people such as we have here can come together and listen to one another, and we may not all disagree, not all agree, but we can listen and learn from other people's perspectives. And this is how it has always been, really. And we're now just moved into a different technology, which we're still, struggling to be comfortable with. But I think it is important, and what I mean is that understand that this is only part of the journey. If we keep having these conversations and keep finding our way into small groups and listening and sharing, that this will spread, just as the work of IONS, which Sharon and I are part of, and were part of back in the early days, 30 or so years ago. They were doing, using science to explore consciousness, which is spirituality. That is now all over the world in all kinds of forms, and people who've never heard of IONS are involved in that. And Shirley and I wrote a piece about that was published in something or other. I suppose it was the IONS Review. But the point is, this is the organic way, the natural way for change to come about, rather than trying to destroy people we don't agree with. We listen to one another and try to find a way to understand one another and stay connected. So that's what we're doing.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I also like to say that in a way, how this technology is actually working is that I am, and if in fact you as well are sitting alone, and you are in fact talking to yourself. So in fact, we are holding a mirror and looking into a screen that is a mirror. So I am the other you, or we are the oneness of each other. We are, the way technology is actually working through the sphere across the globe. It's just amazing. But this is in many ways also a private conversation. So it could even be that we are exercising a way to communicate with ourselves when we are not able to connect that easily. So to keep that integrity on this, call it a mirror talk, personal reflection, as humans have always done when we went to the forest and went for a walk, we were talking to ourselves, maybe. Or singing to ourselves, we did, when we were walking alone or just reflecting or sitting. So I'm another you.
Yes, you are.
Thank you.
I wanted to bring in the word intersectionality that Lisa raised in our last conversation, and just say that I'm drawn to this call. I can attend this call as one of the closing calls in this Now What and Deep Dive series. And it's very personal to me that this series is coming to an end, because even though many gatherings were represented and I feel connected to all the other gatherings, the platform that was created by Ben and Conference Weavers for the follow-through to climate change and consciousness, as well as the other conferences, is very personal to me, because that vision of that gathering came through my body. And I have to reflect back that the mirror we're looking into is not intended to be an all-white mirror. That I think it's so significant that Ben played that song. I'm so grateful to him for doing that, because I really feel that our call to come into community is the call of our indigeneity within us. And I will not be happy with these calls unless they have become more diverse. I'm not blaming anybody for the fact that they're not. I'm not saying we've made a mistake or we're bad for being white or whatever. I'm just saying we won't have the connectedness that we long for until that connectedness is not only multicolored, but when we walk in the forest and we're not just singing to ourselves. I was just walking in the forest and the trees were singing to me, and that's what healed me. It was not me singing to the trees. It was the trees singing to me. And because I'm carrying through the message of climate change and consciousness, that message is Indigenous leadership. We need to be listening to our Indigenous leaders and following them. That is one of the great teachings of climate change and consciousness that needs to be explicated and highlighted and carried forward.
Just one thing in reference to what we saw at and experienced at Climate Change and Consciousness with, just in a nutshell, the Indigenous folks there, and yet the structure was not one that they could easily be leaders for us there in the way it was all set up by someone else in a more westernized cultural way. And our all coming together and discovering that was a wake-up call that happened. You know, unless we had come together and had that happen, there would not be these people, the MCs on their knees in tears apologizing to the Indigenous folks. So, you know, perhaps that was one of the reasons we were there, for them to hear that apology, for those to make that apology as a first step for those beings. And may it blossom from there.
I had the benefit of spending about 10 days with Lila June and other Indigenous leaders 2 years ago, and had ceremony. And that has continued my connection to learn with the elders, with the Indigenous. They're not all old. We have a Miccosukee Seminole tribe clan here in Florida. And what a piece I learned that I wanted to share is the difference between the Indigenous call for listening to the social justice with our African American friends. And that the indigenous are not asking to be assimilated into our culture, but to leave them alone so they can continue their own. And I thought that was a major distinction that I learned and wanted to put this into the record.
Well, of course, the circumstances in which African Americans found themselves on this North American continent and South American continent were very, very, very different from the indigenous peoples of the world. So that we must never, never forget that. And I'm distressed, of course, that there are no African Americans on a call like this. But I live in a town where there are only a handful of African American cities. It's called a city officially. I have a hard time calling it a city since I come from New York City. But anyway, there are only a handful, and I don't know how I could get hold of any of them or the African American friends that I had in the past. I'm not connected to them sufficiently now currently so that I could invite them to come on this kind of a journey. But you know, that's when I was in New York, I was part of a group, and it's still going on, and I still get the notices of it, Undoing Racism. It was started at John Jay College, and now it's meets somewhere else. But there are a lot of those groups, but they take a population of people that are you know, African American and whatever other cultures want to engage. And whereas here in northern New England, you know, they're New Englanders, and not too many people, African Americans, want to live in this kind of an environment just because it's so cold. And there's not much I can do about that.
There's also a history of redlining and expropriation of land and all kinds of other things that have resulted in the segregated living patterns that we have in New England and elsewhere. So I would not assume it is simply the cold weather, although perhaps that's a factor.
I think if you look at the number of Black people in New York, you would say that's probably not a major factor.
It's colder in New Hampshire, though. Well, the wind can howl in those canyons. I coming off the Hudson River, I felt it.
Ben?
Yes.
I'd also like to contribute, since I've been living in Zimbabwe and I was married to an Zimbabwean African man, and I've also been living in Egypt. And the thing about categorizing the historical dimension on first, second, third world, and even fourth world, which is the indigenous world, is an intellectual mental model that we all have. In Europe, especially in Europe, in Oslo, in the bigger areas of multicultural societies. For example, in Oslo, you have a mix of Francophone Africans or English-speaking Africans. You have, which in France, you only have Francophone Africans from colonialized Africa. And that's the same thing in the UK. But being Norwegian, coming from a kind of a sea heritage, my grandparents really on a historical Viking site. So who am I as a human being? Am I indigenous? Or what kind of thing am I? I think we are kind of getting back into this indigenous identity and the mixed and the multicultural faceted we are. So I have a daughter who is a mixed race, if you call it like that. And I could also be my identity could be something else than Norwegian. So people are kind of, we have not a clash of civilization these days. We have a big bang of learning from different civilizations, going 10,000 years back. So we have a wisdom horizon that is getting back down into a present moment. That is a catapult of insights. And this is the extraordinary time we're living in. So we're learning from different cultural systems at an exceptional speed. Every day we can capture through technology a learning exercise from a different culture. But then again, the segregation and the conflict between people with the conflicts in the world, that's going to accelerate with the climate crisis. And where it's an urgency to cultivate the peace culture and compassion. So yes, we have to bring more diverse mix of people into the community like this, but then it is like it is, and we have to accept that gift, so that we are white people with the history that we have. So, yeah.
People who think of themselves as white.
White. You know, we have a mixed identity of all kind. So I'm not typical Norwegian with blonde, long hair and blue eyes.
And I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. I was, my relatives, my grandfather and his two brothers in the 1950s changed the family name from Rappaport to Roberts because they did not want to be automatically identified as Jews. And in New York City, as in business and stuff, people knew what Rappaport was. They knew what clubs you could belong to and which ones you couldn't. So we weren't white. Now I'm white. I grew up thinking I'm white, and in a very theoretically integrated neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, Hyde Park, but in fact there was quite a bit of segregation within that quote integrated community. So you had an all-black high school that was the public school. You had a mixed private school run by the University of Chicago with wealthy black people that could afford to go there, and the kids of University of Chicago professors like Scalia's kids went there, and Saul Bellows' kids went there. Obama's kids went there after I did. And of course the black kids sat with the black kids in the lunchroom and vice versa. But there was some mixing, and but still it is messy and complex. For sure. And yes, I do feel that I have a wish to have a greater diversity represented in the next iterations of this. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the recording here. Oh no, before I do, I think I'm going to close this section. As we began moving into this part of the conversation, I have the words from Lila June, and I'm just going to read them. Unless someone else would like to, actually, I can put them in the chat. Is there a volunteer who would like to do that other than me? I do so much talking on these calls. All right, it's me. They say that history is written by the victors, but how can there be a victor when the war isn't over? The battle has only just begun, and Creator is sending her very best warriors. This time it isn't Indians versus cowboys. No, this time it is all the beautiful races of humanity on the same side, and we are fighting to replace our fear with love. And this time bullets, arrows, and cannonballs will not save us. The only weapons that are useful in this battle are the weapons of truth, of faith, and compassion.